Have you ever substituted ground spices for whole? Or maybe you added them later because you just forgot? Turns out these little insignificant changes, they're not so insignificant, and here's why. Spices have been valued for centuries for their combination of aromatic compounds. And I do mean combination here. They don't get their flavor from just one molecule, but from a whole group of them. And those individual molecules, they all behave kind of differently. Here's a quick demo to help you visualize this. So I'm going to draw a little green line on this piece of paper. You can think of this line as cinnamon flavor. Single color, right? Watch what happens when I dip this strip into some water. As that water moves up, you can kind of see that the colors are starting to separate and we're getting little bands of color. There's some yellows in there, some greens, and even like a couple bits of blue towards the top. Scientists have analyzed cinnamon flavor and found that it has high concentrations of cinnamaldehyde and low concentrations of eugenol and coumarin, among others. That first one, cinnamaldehyde, it's very intense. In fact, it's what they use to make cinnamon candies. The other ones, they're present in very low concentrations and they bring kind of a subtle woodsy, floral, clovey flavor to cinnamon. Cinnamon candies, they don't have these compounds, which is why they smell and taste like cinnamon candy and not cinnamon. Oh, dude, they're hard. I'm not crunching on these. I'm gonna break a tooth. Here's the thing about aromatic compounds. Just like the colors in that green ink move to different degrees in the demo, aromatic compounds and spices move to different degrees when they're heated. The smaller, lighter molecules are more volatile, more easily driven off, and when they are, the flavor of the cinnamon changes. The fact that all spices are made of a combination of aromatics and that those aromatics react differently when heated is what we need to keep in mind when we cook with spices. You probably know that when you're buying spices, whole are preferable to ground. The reason is grinding breaks a compact seed or bark into tiny pieces, increasing the total surface area. The more surface is created, the more escape routes are available for aromatic compounds to leave. Beyond that, the friction created during grinding heats things up, and that speeds the release of volatiles too. In fact, you've probably experienced this if you grind your own spices. And if you haven't, think about the difference between pre-ground pepper and freshly ground pepper. The pre-ground stuff, it just doesn't smell as interesting. What about cooking with whole or ground spices? Let's look at this delicious ground beef recipe that I learned from my friend Sarah. It's called keema, and there are some simple but powerful lessons for us in this recipe. I'm curious, how many of you grind your own spices at home? Let me know in the comments. So I have my ingredients here. I've got my ground beef, which makes up the bulk of this recipe, some whole spices, some ground spices, aromatics, and then some peas to finish. Let's get started. So we've got some black peppercorns, cardamom, black cardamom, a cinnamon stick. Two things are happening right now. As these are heating up, the lighter aromatic compounds, they're kind of being driven off and they smell great. The other thing though is that oil in there, it is capturing some of those aromatic compounds as well because they are oil soluble. What's critical here is because these spices are whole, they're not giving up all of their aromas immediately. You can kind of think of them as time-release spices. They're gonna slowly release volatiles, and that's what allows them to contribute really complex flavor to the finished dish. So now that we've begun infusing flavors into this oil, we can get in our next ingredient, which is onions. I'm gonna let these go. I'll stir them occasionally, and what I'm looking for is really deep browning. That's gonna be a lot of the flavor for this dish. These onions have some great color. I'm gonna get the rest of our aromatics in, and that's gonna be ginger and garlic. And this is just gonna take 30 seconds to cook out. Great, so now we'll get our beef in, along with some salt. So I really wanna give this a bunch of good stirs as it cooks. The goal is to break our beef up into little chunks, make sure that salt is evenly dispersed. As this meat cooks, it's gonna release a bunch of juices. What I wanna do is to keep cooking it until a lot of that liquid has evaporated and the sizzling sound comes back. So while we're waiting on this, I wanna tell you about ATK classes. You're gonna find step-by-step videos, photos, and recipes that cover all skill levels, and the classes are led by my talented colleagues. You'll find them exclusively in the America's Test Kitchen app. Remember how grinding opens up lots of escape routes for volatiles? That means we can think of ground spices as fast-acting spices, and adding them later on in cooking, that helps us retain more of their flavor. We also want to use the fat in the recipe to capture those volatiles. This sizzling sound, It's an indicator that the liquid in the bottom of this pot, it's mostly fat, making this the right time to add our ground coriander, Kashmiri chili powder, turmeric, and cumin. I'm giving these just a minute or so to infuse, and then we're gonna get the remaining ingredients in. Tomato, yogurt, and a split chili. So I want to stir this around to help those tomatoes heat up. Once they do, they're going to release their juices. Then we'll let this come to a simmer. I'll pop a lid on. So the sauciness of keema is kind of up to you. I like it when it looks a little bit like Sloppy Joe's so that the meat is nicely coated, but it's not too soupy. Once it gets to that point, we'll finish it with some peas and cilantro, and then it's ready to serve. So these are going to take 2 minutes to warm through, and then we'll get some cilantro in there. Now, I sometimes take the time to remove the whole spices, but it's not necessary. I've always kind of assumed that if you grew up with this sort of dish, you appreciate the extra effort that the cook does when they go and pick out the cardamom pods and whatnot, but you also know not to chomp down on a cinnamon stick. Awesome, let's eat. I'm gonna napkin. Now, all of this is coated in this sauce that is so complex. You've got that warmth from the cinnamon, the earthy, deep flavors from, there's a smokiness from the black cardamom and an earthiness from the turmeric. And then because we got the cumin and coriander in later, they're bringing kind of these earthy, piney notes that you don't always get when they go in at the beginning. It's fantastic. By the way, this is the 4-2 version of this recipe. If there's a recipe that's tricky to scale because, say, the size of the pot has to change or an ingredient can't be cut in half easily, we'll actually do the work for you. You'll find 4-2 versions of lots of recipes on our website. Of course, you don't have to start with whole spices to get a full spectrum of spice flavor. Steve Dunn uses ground spices exclusively in his chicken karahi. The key is he doesn't add them all at the same time. So we'll start by getting some oil and butter into our pan. So just a handful of aromatics here, garlic and ginger in about equal parts. You guys, this smells good. The first batch of spices I'm adding, they are here for their kind of heavier, deeper, earthier flavors, but also the Kashmiri chili powder, it's gonna bring this beautiful orangey red color to this dish. It's gonna go right in. Next up, I've got some black pepper. This is cumin. Now we've got some coriander, red pepper flakes, and a little bit of salt. Now, because I added these spices early, some of their lighter elements, like the lemoniness of the coriander, that's not really going to be present, but I don't need them. I'm going to be adding more spices later for those top notes. So we can get our chicken in. These are bone-in pieces, dark meat only, because it's just a little bit easier to cook. It brings a little more depth of flavor and can kind of stand up to the heavy spicing. So this chicken's no longer pink. We can get our tomatoes in. So I'm gonna let this cook, and I'll come by and give it a stir occasionally to make sure nothing's sticking. After 20 or 25 minutes, those tomatoes are gonna break down and they're gonna cook and thicken and reduce into a sauce, and that chicken, it's gonna become tender. So it's been about 25 minutes, and you can see how much this is darkened and reduced. It's really concentrated in flavor now, and that chicken is super tender. I'm gonna turn this down because it doesn't actually need to reduce much more, and get the rest of our ingredients in. I've got a serrano chili for heat, some cilantro, and then our spices. So this is our second edition of spices. This is cardamom and cinnamon. So one quick stir to get them in there, and then this just needs another 5 minutes to make sure those spice flavors disperse throughout that sauce, and then we can eat. Well, I can eat, sorry. This chicken is so tender, and it's spicy from the chilies and the peppers, but also you get this kind of soft lemony mentholy thing from the cardamom and a little bit of kind of sweetness from the cinnamon. It's really lovely. One of my favorite recipes that I've ever worked on was kare raisu, or Japanese curry rice. It's based on a Japanese take on curry powder, and I find it so comforting and complex and fun to make and personalize. I also get a lot of questions about the spices in the blend. So my curry blend, it calls for 11 spices, and I love it as is. The thing I learned while putting it together was to think about the blend as a musical ensemble. When you hear a 4-piece band, can you pick out an individual instrument? Probably. Can you pick out a single instrument when the band has 11 members? It's a little trickier. Now imagine if you lose 2 members from those ensembles. The music's going to change pretty radically if you lose half your band. And even in that larger group, losing 2 players, it's going to make a difference, even though it might not be apparent to everybody listening. Spice blends work the same way. If you're making a spice blend that has only a handful of ingredients, one change is going to be noticeable. I would love for you to try my curry blend as is, but if you do need to make changes because you can't track down ground brown mustard seeds, but you happen to have powdered yellow mustard, that's okay to make that substitution. You're going to end up with something a little bit different than what I intended, but it'll be close. Similar deal if you want to leave out, say, the fenugreek. But if you want to leave out 3 spices and make substitutions for 2 of the other ones, well, I'm sorry, you're on your own. Besides the length of the ingredient list, the other surprising thing about this recipe is that I start with ground spices. The reason is it's really time-consuming to grind spices so that they're uniformly fine. I literally spent hours grinding, sifting, and then regrinding spices. And even then, the curry I made with those home ground spices, it was a little bit gritty. Starting with fresh jars of ground spices ended up being a lot more practical. All of this is to say there's nothing wrong with using ground spices. This is especially true since I know, and now you know, that when you use them, you can enhance their flavor by adding a little bit more towards the end of cooking. That said, I keep both whole and ground spices at home because I want the complexity of time-release whole spices and the convenience of ground spices.